In 1969, during an NBC television interview, watched by more than 400 million people worldwide, Prince Philip was asked whether the royal family had any financial difficulties. He paused just long enough for the silence to register, and then said, with absolute seriousness, that the family might have to move to a smaller house. "We may have to move into smaller premises," he told the interviewer. "We had to sell a small yacht." The small yacht was the Bloodhound, a 63-foot racing vessel. The smaller premises he was implying they might retreat to was still a palace. The interviewer, unsure whether this was a joke or a complaint, moved on. The audience laughed. The palace issued no correction, and Philip, who had just told a global audience that the British monarchy was essentially going broke while occupying Buckingham Palace, carried on as though he had said nothing unusual at all. That moment, the deadpan provocation, the institutional silence, the world left to figure out how seriously to take him, was not an accident. It was a method. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, occupied one of the strangest positions in 20th century public life. He was not the monarch. He held no constitutional power. His role, officially, was to walk 2 steps behind his wife, attend engagements, and say nothing that might overshadow the crown. For 73 years, from his marriage to Princess Elizabeth in November 1947 until his death in April 2021, that was the job description. The reality of how he performed it bore almost no resemblance to those expectations. Philip was born on the island of Corfu on June 10, 1921, into the Greek and Danish royal families, houses that sounded grand but were, by the 1920s, functionally bankrupt and politically exiled. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece, was court-martialed after the Greek military disaster in Asia Minor in 1922 and evacuated by a British warship, with his infant son carried in a cot fashioned from an orange crate. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, was later diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent years in sanatoriums across Europe before eventually founding a Greek Orthodox nursing order in Athens. Philip's childhood was not the gilded upbringing that the word prince suggests. He was passed between relatives, an uncle in France, another in England, and educated at schools in Paris, England, and finally Gordonston in Scotland, where the headmaster Kurt Hahn ran the institution on principles of physical endurance and personal responsibility that would mark Philip's character permanently. By the time he entered the Royal Navy as a cadet at Dartmouth in 1939, Philip was 18 years old, effectively stateless and entirely self-reliant. The war gave him purpose and structure. He served with distinction at the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941, one of the Royal Navy's last major fleet engagements in the Mediterranean, where his handling of searchlight operations aboard HMS Valiant was noted in dispatches. He was mentioned in dispatches again after operations in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Biographer Philip Eade, in his 2011 work Young Prince Philip, described him as one of the most able young officers in the fleet. The man who married the future Queen in Westminster Abbey on November 20, 1947, was not some passive consort waiting to be absorbed by the institution. He was a naval officer with a legitimate career, a sharp intellect, and no particular talent for deference. The palace, from the very beginning, had a problem it never quite solved. Within weeks of his marriage, Philip discovered that the household staff at Clarence Lodge reported not to him, but to the King's private secretary. He attempted to reorganize the domestic schedule, mealtimes, staffing rotas, the arrangement of rooms, and was rebuffed. Tommy Lascelles, King George VI's formidable private secretary, regarded Philip as an outsider with dangerous modernizing impulses. In a letter to a colleague documented by historian Ben Pimlott in his 1996 biography, The Queen, Lascelles referred to Philip as rough and uneducated, adding that he was not yet domesticated. Philip, upon learning of these assessments through court gossip, did not retreat. He simply began doing things without asking permission. That became the template. Where the institution blocked the front door, Philip found a window. In 1956, Philip departed on a 4-month voyage aboard the royal yacht Britannia, ostensibly to open the Melbourne Olympic Games and tour Commonwealth nations in the South Pacific. The trip extended from October 1956 to February 1957, far longer than any official engagement required. His private secretary, Michael Parker, accompanied him. The two men had served together in the Navy and shared a taste for irreverence that made the palace deeply nervous. During the voyage, Philip grew a beard, a small act that generated outsized coverage in the British press, where it was taken as a signal of deliberate nonconformity. Biographer Tim Heald, in his authorized 1991 account, The Duke, a portrait of Prince Philip, noted that the beard became a running story in Fleet Street, with columnists speculating about what it symbolized. When Parker's wife filed for divorce during the trip, the press linked Parker's marital troubles to Philip by proximity and innuendo. The palace responded by arranging Parker's quiet resignation. Philip was reportedly furious, not at the coverage, but at the institution's willingness to sacrifice his closest friend to manage a headline. The voyage revealed something important. Philip would leave when the walls closed in, and the palace would clean up after him rather than confront him directly. In May 1961, Philip gave an interview to the Daily Express, one of the few occasions he spoke directly to a tabloid reporter. The journalist Donald Edgar asked about his role within the monarchy. Philip's response, documented in Edgar's own published account, was blunt. "I am nothing but a bloody amoeba," he said. "I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." This was a reference to the 1952 Privy Council decision, made shortly after Elizabeth's accession, that the royal house would remain Windsor rather than adopting Philip's surname, Mountbatten. Lord Mountbatten, Philip's uncle, had lobbied hard for the change and lost. Philip experienced the ruling as a personal humiliation, a declaration that he was, in dynastic terms, irrelevant. The amoeba line was picked up by every Fleet Street paper within 24 hours. The palace declined to comment. A partial concession came in 1960, when the Queen agreed that certain descendants would carry the hyphenated surname Mountbatten-Windsor. Philip accepted it without public comment. But the bitterness, according to multiple sources including biographer Giles Brandreth in his 2004 book Philip and Elizabeth, never fully faded. During a 1966 state visit to Paraguay, then under the military dictatorship of Alfredo Stroessner, Philip was presented with a ceremonial guard of honor. The soldiers stood at rigid attention. The protocol called for Philip to inspect the line in silence, with perhaps a polite nod. Instead, according to diplomatic cables later cited by journalist Graham Turner in his 2002 biography, Elizabeth, the Woman and the Queen, Philip stopped midway through the inspection and said, loudly enough for the accompanying press corps to hear, "It's a pleasant change to be in a country that isn't ruled by its people." The remark could be read as dry wit or as a genuine compliment to an authoritarian regime. The Paraguayan hosts chose the latter interpretation and beamed. The Foreign Office, monitoring the visit from London, chose to read it as humour and issued no clarification. The incident captures a recurring dynamic. Philip said exactly what he meant, but constructed it so that every listener could choose their own interpretation, and the palace could always claim it was a joke. In 1984, Philip accepted an invitation to address the World Wildlife Fund's International Conference in Assisi, Italy. He had been president of the organization since 1981, and the speech was meant to align conservation with interfaith dialogue, a prestigious, carefully managed event. Philip's address, delivered in the Basilica of San Francesco, included a passage in which he remarked that he would like to be reincarnated as a particularly deadly virus in order to contribute to solving the problem of human overpopulation. The line, reported by the Press Association and subsequently quoted in newspapers across Europe, drew immediate condemnation from Catholic clergy and population ethics groups. The Vatican made no formal response, but Italian newspapers ran the quote on front pages for 2 days. Philip never retracted the statement. Biographer Ingrid Seward, in her 2005 work Prince Philip Revealed, later confirmed that Philip repeated similar sentiments in private correspondence. The remark was not a slip, it was a conviction, delivered in a basilica to a room full of religious leaders without a flicker of diplomatic caution. The palace, as usual, said nothing. Yet the same man who detonated verbal grenades in public was, by almost every private account, a far more complicated figure than the gaff reel suggests. In 1956, Philip launched the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, a youth development programme that by the time of his death in 2021 had operated in more than 140 countries and engaged more than 6 million young people. The programme was Philip's own design, rooted in the Gordonston principles of Kurt Hahn, and he oversaw its structure with genuine intellectual rigour. Biographer Tim Heald described Philip attending planning meetings well into his 80s, marking up briefing papers with detailed annotations and returning them with questions that organisers found uncomfortably sharp. This was not the work of a man performing charity for cameras. The award scheme's emphasis on physical endurance, community service, and self-reliance was, in a real sense, Philip's autobiography, the childhood he had lived, distilled into a programme for other people's children. What the public saw was a prince who made rude jokes. What the programme's staff saw was a man who cared deeply about whether a 15-year-old in Nairobi could complete a hiking expedition. During the aftermath of Diana's death in August 1997, public attention focused almost entirely on the Queen's perceived coldness and the palace's slow response. What emerged only later, primarily through the 2006 account by royal correspondent Robert Hardman in his book Monarchy, was that Philip had played a decisive role in the days between Diana's death on August 31st and the funeral on September 6th. It was Philip who persuaded the Queen to return to London from Balmoral. It was Philip who insisted on the public walkabout outside Kensington Palace, overriding advisers who feared hostile crowds. And on the day of the funeral itself, when 12-year-old Prince Harry hesitated at the prospect of walking behind his mother's coffin through streets lined with grieving, unpredictable crowds, it was Philip who said to him, according to Hardman's account, "If you don't walk, I think you'll regret it later. If I walk, will you walk with me?" Harry walked. The image of that procession became one of the defining photographs of the decade. Philip's role in making it happen was not reported at the time. In the early 2000s, a cache of private letters between Philip and Diana became public during the inquest into her death. The letters, read aloud in court in 2008, revealed a correspondence that was far warmer than anyone outside the family had expected. Philip addressed Diana as "Dearest Diana." He wrote that he understood her difficulties with Charles. He told her that he and the Queen had done their best to help, but acknowledged that they had not always succeeded. Coroner Lord Justice Scott Baker noted in his summation that the letters showed genuine concern and affection. The tabloid narrative, Philip as the cold patriarch who drove Diana from the family, did not survive contact with the actual documents. The letters revealed a man who could be both deeply private and deeply empathetic, but who had no interest in performing that empathy for public consumption. The gap between what people assumed about Philip and what the evidence showed was, in this case, enormous. Philip's relationship with the press was adversarial from the beginning, but his management of photographers reveals a more nuanced strategy than simple hostility. During a 1982 visit to a Kenyan wildlife reserve, Philip was photographed by press corps cameras while on a conservation tour. When a photographer moved too close, Philip turned directly toward the lens and said, as recorded by journalist James Whittaker, who was present, "You have the manners of a pig, you really do." The photographer, momentarily stunned, lowered his camera. Other members of the press pool documented the exchange. What Whittaker noted in his later account was that Philip then spent 20 minutes in extended, relaxed conversation with a different group of journalists who had maintained the agreed distance. The confrontation was not indiscriminate rage. It was enforcement of a boundary, performed publicly so that every photographer on the trip understood the terms. Philip's rudeness, when examined closely, frequently served a structural purpose. It was policy delivered as personality. In 2011, at the age of 90, Philip attended a state banquet at Dublin Castle during the Queen's historic visit to the Republic of Ireland, the first by a reigning British monarch since Irish independence. The visit was loaded with political sensitivity. Philip, whose uncle, Lord Mountbatten, had been assassinated by the IRA in 1979, had personal reasons to find the occasion difficult. According to diplomatic sources cited by royal biographer Robert Lacey in his 2020 book Battle of Brothers, Philip was composed throughout the evening. He spoke in measured terms with the Irish president, Mary McAleese. When McAleese later described the visit publicly, she singled out Philip's demeanour, not the Queen's, as the moment that convinced her the visit would succeed. "He set the tone," McAleese said in a 2012 interview with RTE. "There was no stiffness, there was grace." The man who had been called rude, insensitive, and diplomatically reckless had, when it mattered most, been the one who made a fraught evening work. The pattern that emerges across 7 decades of documented evidence is not the simple one that either Philip's critics or his admirers prefer. He was not merely a gaffe-prone husband trailing behind the Queen, nor was he the secretly brilliant strategist that some revisionist accounts suggest. What the evidence supports is something more interesting than either version. Philip operated within an institution that had no formal role for him, no clear authority, and no established precedent for a male consort in the modern era. Prince Albert, the last comparable figure, had died in 1861 and had occupied a very different constitutional landscape. Philip had to invent his own position. The tools he used were the ones available to him: directness, provocation, physical presence, and an absolute refusal to perform the submissive role that the institution implicitly demanded. His public remarks, examined in sequence rather than as isolated incidents, follow a consistent logic. He said what the palace could not say. He tested boundaries that the Queen, as sovereign, could never test herself. And the palace's response, the long silences, the absent corrections, the strategic non-engagement, was itself a policy. The institution did not fail to notice Philip's behaviour. It chose, repeatedly and deliberately, not to. Because the things Philip said and did served a function. He absorbed criticism that might otherwise have landed on the Crown. He created a space of unpredictability around an institution whose survival depends on the appearance of stability. He was, in structural terms, a pressure valve, and both he and the palace understood that, even if neither ever said so publicly. Giles Brandreth, who knew Philip personally over several decades, wrote in Philip and Elizabeth that the Duke understood his role better than anyone, including the people who thought he didn't understand it at all. If this kind of evidence-based history is something you find valuable, accounts built on documented sources rather than tabloid assumptions, then subscribing to this channel costs nothing and ensures you see the next one when it goes up. The bell notification is the only reliable way to catch these when they publish, and there are more stories like this one already in preparation. The gap between public image and private reality is rarely what you expect, and the closer you look at the documentation, the wider that gap tends to become. In 1969, Prince Philip told a global television audience that the royal family might have to move to a smaller house. The line was absurd on its face. A man living in Buckingham Palace, married to one of the wealthiest women in the world, performing financial hardship for the cameras. It was easy to dismiss as tone deafness or arrogance, or the particular blindness of hereditary privilege. But look at what happened next. The documentary that interview was part of, Royal Family, directed by Richard Corsten for the BBC, became one of the most watched programmes in British television history. It humanised the monarchy at a moment when public support was uncertain, when republicanism was a serious intellectual position in British politics, and when the institution needed, badly, to appear accessible. Philip's remark, the yacht, the smaller premises, the perfectly timed pause, was not a man failing to read the room. It was a man who understood exactly what the room needed and gave it to them in a form they could laugh at. The palace never commented on the line. The Queen, according to multiple accounts, did not object to it. And the documentary achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. Philip had written his own script, delivered it on his own terms, and let the institution pretend it hadn't noticed. He had been doing that since 1947. He would keep doing it until the end. That was the job he invented, and it was the only job in the palace that nobody else could have done.